everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this all the time, so if that is something that you think you might want to stick around for, then I would love it if you could subscribe to this channel. I've decided to make it my goal to get to 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, which might be a little bit unrealistic, but I'm putting it out into the universe and we will see if it happens. And actually, according to my YouTube analytics page, around 47% of my viewers aren't actually subscribed. So if that's you, maybe consider hitting the subscribe button. It's completely free and it just means that YouTube will let you know when I've posted a video. Anyway, today we are going to be talking about the case of Rachel Nickell, and as you can tell from the length of this video, this is a big case. This case happened in London in England and it was such a famous case at the time. So if you're from the UK, you may have actually heard of this case. I do just want to say a huge thank you to Jonathan, one of my Patreon members, for suggesting that I cover it. Now, because this is such a big case, there is honestly so much information about it online. I've tried my absolute hardest to collect what I believe to be the most factually correct information, but due to how big this case was, there's always a chance that I might have missed something or, you know, gotten something wrong. If that is the case, then please, as with all of my true crime videos, feel free to politely correct me in the comments. I also read a book about this case as part of my research. This is the book. It's called Letting Go and it was written by Alex Hanscom, who is actually the son of Rachel Nickell, the victim in this case. And Alex himself, as you'll come to learn, is such a huge part in this story. So if any of you guys want to give this book a read, I'll leave a link below to where you can purchase it. This isn't sponsored or anything, by the way. I bought this book with my own money to read as part of my research into this case. But anyway, I'm gonna stop rambling now. I feel like this intro has been so long, so let's just get into the case of Rachel Nickell. So this case took place in the year 1992 in the area of Wimbledon in southwest London. And this is Rachel Jane Nickell. She was a 23-year-old woman born on the 23rd of November 1968 to her parents Andrew and Monica Nickell, and she was one of two siblings. She had a brother named Mark. Rachel was raised in Great Totham, which is a parish village in Essex, and from what I can gather, she was always a very kind and generous person. Even as a child, she would always want to help out the old people and disabled children who lived in the same area that she did. She also loved the performing arts. She had a huge passion for singing, acting and ballet dancing, and her teachers said that she was just a natural at it. I think they probably thought that she would pursue it as a career. However, instead she decided to study for an English literature degree at university. Alongside her degree, I believe she also did some modelling work here and there, and she also had a job as a lifeguard at a swimming pool in the town of Richmond in London. And at age 19, while she was working as a lifeguard in London, she met a man named Andre Hanscom, who was 25 years old. Andre was a semi-professional tennis player and a motorbike courier, and when the two met, they began chatting and they decided to go on a date together. And they honestly hit it off straight away. Rachel really liked this guy. In fact, after their first date was over, Rachel actually rang her mother Monica and told her that she had found the man that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, and that was after their first date. And not long after they began dating, Rachel found out that she was pregnant, and so she moved into a flat with Andre in Balham in South London. The pregnancy was initially a shock to the both of them, and they weren't sure what they were going to do. They weren't sure if they were ready to raise a child, but ultimately they agreed to have this baby, and on the 11th of August 1989, Rachel gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Alex, and they were both just absolutely besotted with their son. Rachel decided to put her degree to one side when Alex was born. I think she wanted to focus on looking after him, although I read on a couple of sources that she didn't really enjoy her degree too much anyway, and she actually hoped to do children's TV presenting one day because she was such a natural on camera. But I think for the time being, she was just so happy with her life. She thrived being a mother, and she was just so content with her little family. She had her partner Andre, her son Alex, and they also had a rescue dog, a Labrador cross greyhound named Mollie. Rachel called her family her little pack, and everything just seemed to be going really well for her. She had high hopes for the future and her whole life ahead of her, but that would all be snatched away on the 15th of July 1992. That day started just as any other normal day for Rachel and her family. You see, Rachel and her son Alex, who at this point was 2 years old, he was about a couple of weeks away from his 3rd birthday, and they had gotten into a bit of a routine where most mornings they would take their dog Mollie for a walk once Andre had gone to work. They wouldn't always go on like the same walk. I think they would switch up where they went a lot, but on this particular day they decided to walk on Wimbledon Common, which is a huge open countryside space, obviously in Wimbledon in London. The area is 1,140 acres, and it consists of like woodlands, ponds, recreation areas. There is a wide variety of wildlife. It's just a really beautiful place. A place that a lot of people would love to visit. In fact, on a hot summer's weekend, the Common would have literally thousands and thousands of visitors. But on the morning of Wednesday the 15th of July 1992, there were only about 500 people on the Common, so it was pretty quiet. I mean, that still sounds like a lot of people, but for the Common, that was quiet. So Rachel and little Alex drove to the area of Wimbledon Common that morning with their dog Mollie, and when they got there they began their walk. Now, although the Common was quite an open space for the most part, I believe there were a few areas that were covered and concealed with trees, and it was whilst Rachel and Alex were walking through a concealed wooded area that they were attacked by a stranger who had been watching them during their walk. As they were walking, both Rachel and her 2-year-old son Alex had a sense that something was about to happen. They had a sense that someone was behind them, and so they both looked back. And when they did, when they looked back, they saw a man with a black bag over his shoulder, and he was coming towards them. This man grabbed 2-year-old Alex and threw him to the ground, his face landing in the mud, and then this man got out a knife and began stabbing 23-year-old Rachel Nickell repeatedly. Now, despite Alex being only a couple of weeks away from his 3rd birthday at the time, he says that even to this day he remembers the attack, and he said that it all happened so quickly, and he goes into detail about what he remembers in the book. But he recalls being thrown to the ground by the man, his face being dragged through the mud, and by the time he managed to pick himself back up, his mother Rachel had collapsed next to him, and he remembers watching the attacker walk to a stream nearby and washing the blood off his hands, and then he just disappeared. He walked away after having savagely attacked Rachel. Despite everything that had just happened, Alex recalls his mother actually looking very peaceful when she was on the ground. She looked like she was just asleep and that she was going to wake up at any minute, but she didn't. And so because he thought she was just asleep, he started shouting to her and saying, "Get up, mummy, get up, mummy." But he soon realised that she couldn't because she was dead. Despite being only 2 years old, Alex says that in that moment he realised that his mother was gone and that she was never coming back. So Alex began running back up the pathway that he and his mother had walked down together just minutes before the attack. And when he got out of the sheltered wooded area, when he was in the open space again, strangers ran towards him because obviously this 2-year-old boy was on his own. He was frantic and he was covered in bruises and mud and his mother's blood. So the police were called and Alex was sedated and taken to the hospital, and news very quickly spread about this attack. The case became national news. The story was printed about in newspapers immediately. The media were reporting on it. The press were gathering around the Common and outside of the hospital where little Alex was, because it soon became clear that although there were around 500 people on Wimbledon Common that morning, there had only been one witness to the attack, and that witness was Rachel's 2-year-old son, Alex. So Rachel's partner Andre was contacted. If you remember, he was at work that morning, so the police got in contact with him and they let him know what had happened and that his 2-year-old son was in the hospital. And so Andre left for work straight away to go and be with his son, and whilst he was on his way to the hospital, he was actually thinking about what method he was going to use to end both his life and his son's life. Because Alex had such an attachment to his mother Rachel, as most children do with their mothers, and Andre just thought that there was no way that he would want to go on, he would want to live if he didn't have his mother. And also Andre himself was so heartbroken over the loss of his partner, and I think that he probably didn't want to go on without her either, and so he really considered ending both of their lives that day, but thankfully he didn't. When he eventually arrived at the hospital, he was prepared by a child psychologist before seeing his son, and they told Andre that he needed to make it clear to Alex that his mother was gone and that she was never coming back. But as I said before, Alex already knew that. He had watched his mother die, and at such a young age he already had this understanding of death. He understood that he would never see his mother again. So the police and detectives gathered around Wimbledon Common, the scene of the crime, and they took the names and details of the 500 people that were on the common that morning so they could question and interview them. Although when they did, it seemed like no one had actually seen anything. No one had seen Rachel's killer leaving the scene, which was really surprising to the police because this attack was so brutal. You would expect that the killer would have been absolutely covered in blood, and the fact that no one saw a blood-soaked man leaving the scene is baffling. It seems that the killer was very lucky. The scene where Rachel's body was obviously cordoned off and photographs were taken, and eventually Rachel's body was taken for an autopsy, which concluded that she had been sexually assaulted by her attacker and that she had sustained around 49 stab wounds on her body, and one of these stab wounds was across her neck, and it was so vicious that it literally almost decapitated her. And one fact about the case that absolutely broke my heart was that when detectives first examined the scene, when they found Rachel's body, they noticed that she had a receipt or some bit of paper on her forehead. And initially they were really confused about what it was, why this bit of paper had been placed on her forehead. But eventually it was determined that this receipt had fallen out of Rachel's pocket or bag during the attack, during the struggle, and that her son Alex had actually picked it up off the ground and placed it on her head thinking that it was a plaster or a bandage and that it would make her better. Honestly, when I first read that, I was a mess. Anyway, in terms of the evidence the investigators had in this case, well, they really didn't have much at all. They were unable to pick up on or detect any DNA evidence because, of course, this was the early 1990s and that kind of technology was very limited back then. It wasn't nearly as advanced and useful as it is today. According to one documentary I watched about this case, they did pick up on what they called a minute speck on Rachel's body that they believed could have been DNA, could have been traces of DNA, but due to the limited forensic technology they had at the time, they couldn't concretely say that it was DNA, and so it was kind of useless. Already they knew that they were going to struggle with this case because in terms of forensic evidence they had none. All they could really find evidence-wise was a shoe print that was left at the scene, and there were also traces of red paint in 2-year-old Alex's hair, and they had no idea where this red paint had come from. As for witnesses, again, there weren't really any. No one apart from Alex seemed to have witnessed Rachel's murder, and so it was almost like detectives had reached a dead end before the investigation had even begun. But the detectives knew that they had to find this man ASAP because this attacker just seemed to be a complete stranger to Rachel. It seemed like he was just on the common that day looking to attack anyone, and when he did attack, it was in the most brutal and vicious way. He was clearly a very dangerous individual, and the police knew that if they didn't find him soon, there was a high chance that he would strike again and murder someone else. The day after Rachel was killed, her partner Andre did a televised appeal urging anyone with any information regarding Rachel's killer to come forward. The police hoped that this appeal would generate more tips and leads, and it worked. They received hundreds of phone calls following the appeal, but none of them really seemed to help with the investigation. None of them were really significant. Meanwhile, 2 detectives were trying to get as much information about the attack from 2-year-old Alex, who was the only witness. He was the only person to actually see the killer's face. But of course, he was only 2, and so there was a good chance that he wouldn't remember anything about what the killer actually looked like. But just in case he did, the police set up recording devices and cameras in his grandparents' home where he was staying, so that if he ever mentioned the attack or said anything about the killer, they would know about it. They would have it on camera. The 2 detectives assigned to try and get information out of Alex would often visit him and his father Andre, and on some of these visits they brought along with them different looking dolls. So like one doll would have white skin, one doll would have black skin, one would have grey hair, one would have brown hair, etc. And the detectives would pick up each doll, show it to Alex and say, did the bad man who hurt Mummy look like this Alex? Just to see if it would jog his memory. Let's say the killer had grey hair and the detectives picked up the grey haired doll and said to Alex, is this what he looked like? Did he have this coloured hair? It might jog Alex's memory and he might be able to give them more information about what the killer looked like. And eventually the detectives managed to get a pretty detailed description from Alex about the attacker. He said that he was a white man with short hair, he wore a white shirt with a collar and buttons, and he was wearing a bout, but this bout was like over his shirt rather than his trousers. He said that he had blue trousers, brown shoes, and he was carrying a black bag. This was what Alex described to the detectives. Of course, they can't take this for gospel because, like I've said many times, he was literally only 2 or 3 years old, so it was likely that his memory of the man wouldn't be too accurate, but it does give the detectives an indicator as to what the attacker may have looked like. Alex also began seeing a child psychologist. She was an older woman. In the book, Alex describes her as being like a grandmotherly figure, and Alex would go to this psychologist's house with his father and the 2 detectives, and he would play with his toys there, he would colour, and the psychologist would try and get him to talk about his memories of the attack. So she would say stuff to Alex like, "Can you please help us catch this bad man? Tell us what he did to your lovely mummy. What did you see, Alex?" She would say things along those lines, again, to try and jog his memory, but he didn't like it. Of course, this 2-year-old boy didn't want to hear about that. He didn't want to think about that. He was happy just playing with his toys, and he would actually try and drown out the sound of the psychologist talking to him by banging the toys on the table. It must have been so distressing for him to have gone through what he went through, to have witnessed what he did, and then to have to go through it over and over and over again with the detectives and the psychologists in an attempt to help them catch the murderer. Obviously, they were all doing it with good intentions. They were trying to catch the killer, but Alex just didn't want to hear it. And on top of all of this, the press were literally hounding Alex and his father, Andre. As I mentioned earlier, this case gained so much media attention. The story was huge. Alex was honestly like a little celebrity. He became known as the boy who watched his mother be stabbed to death. And so the press were desperately trying to speak to both of them, both Andre and Alex, and they were even trying to take pictures of Alex to sell to media outlets. They would wait outside their home to try and get pictures of Alex. They even tried to take pictures of him at his own mother's funeral. Andre literally had to like put something over Alex's head to cover his face so that they wouldn't take his picture at his own mother's funeral. It's insane. But back to the investigation. So the detectives had been questioning people, they had been eliminating suspects and taking hundreds and hundreds of witness statements, but they still seem to have a huge lack of evidence in this case. And so they decided to take a different approach at trying to narrow down who the killer might have been. And they reached out to a criminal profiler named Paul Britton. Now, I mentioned Paul in a previous video of mine, the video about Robert Black, as he helped detectives in that case. If you don't know what a criminal profiler does, they basically help the detectives create a psychological profile of the killer based on their behaviours and the details of the attack, so that they can identify potential suspects based on this profile. I hope that makes sense. So for example, if the criminal profiler said that the killer was likely to be a man between the age of 30 to 40, the detectives would narrow down their search and look at men specifically in that age bracket. And that's exactly what they wanted Paul Britton to do. They wanted him to come up with a psychological / character profile of Rachel Nickell's murderer. Now, Paul theorised that Rachel's killer was likely to be under 30 years old. He was probably between 20 to 30, and he was local to Wimbledon Common. He knew the area well. He may have still lived with his parents, or he lived on his own. He probably watched a lot of pornography. He likely didn't have a girlfriend at the time, and if he did have any previous girlfriends, he was probably very domineering sexually. He may have wanted to act out violent fantasies during sex. And Paul said that the killer may have also had a history of minor sexual offences in the past. So detectives used this profile from Paul Britton, Alex's description of the killer, and a statement from a witness to create a photo fit of their main suspect in the case. Like I mentioned earlier, the police had received several tips and leads from the public. They had taken so many witness statements, but none of them really proved to be very useful or credible, apart from one in particular, the one that was used to help create the photo fit of the suspect. This particular witness statement came from a woman called Jane, and she said that on the morning of Rachel's murder, she saw a man on Wimbledon Common, and he was acting suspiciously. He was being a bit weird. Jane said that it seemed like this man didn't really know where he was going. He didn't know which route to take on the Common, and she also said that it seemed like he didn't want her to look at his face. Every time she would try to look at him, he would turn away so that she couldn't see his face. And obviously, if that man was Rachel's killer, that would make sense, because he wouldn't want anyone to see his face. He wouldn't want people to be able to identify him later. Jane also said that a couple of minutes later, she saw the same man, and he looked like he was following another woman on the Common. So because of this, the man she saw became the prime suspect in the investigation, and she helped draw up a sketch and a photo fit of what he looked like. So I'll put that on screen now. It was released to the public, and the TV show Crime Watch did a segment about Rachel's case in which they discussed Paul Britton's character profile and the photo fit, and very quickly the police started receiving several calls from the public about who Rachel's attacker might have been. And one name in particular came up quite a few times in these phone calls. It seemed that quite a few people knew of a man that looked very similar to the photo fit image of the suspect. And this man was named Colin Stagg. Now, at the time in 1992, Colin Stagg was 29 years old, and he lived with just his dog in a flat in Wimbledon on the Roehampton estate, less than a mile away from Wimbledon Common, where 23-year-old Rachel Nickell was killed. Colin was single. From what I can gather, he was a bit of a loner. He was also unemployed at the time, and he had actually been on Wimbledon Common on the morning that Rachel and Alex were attacked, which I'll talk more about in a second. And like I said, a lot of people seem to think he looked like the photo fit of the main suspect, and so very quickly he became the main suspect in Rachel's murder. Now, I'm just going to let you know this now, because I feel like explaining it in this way will just make the most sense as I go through the case. But Colin Stagg was not Rachel's killer. This case is solved. We know who the real killer was. You guys will obviously find out later on in the video. But it was not Colin Stagg. He was completely innocent. And because he was innocent, there was literally no solid evidence linking him to the crime. However, by this point, when Colin Stagg first came to the police's attention, it had been weeks since Rachel's murder. I believe by this point it was September of 1992, so around 2 months since Rachel's death, and the pressure was really on the Metropolitan Police to solve this case and catch this dangerous man. Because of how publicised this case was, everyone was talking about it, everyone was scared because a killer was on the loose. And so detectives really wanted to nip this case in the bud and solve it. And so it was almost like, even though they had no evidence against Colin, they had already made up their minds that it was him, that he was the killer, and they even set up an operation called Operation Ezdell to implicate him in this crime, a crime that he didn't commit, and I'll get on to Operation Ezdell soon. But first, I'll just run through what Colin Stagg had been doing on the morning that Rachel was killed, because as I mentioned before, he had been on the Common that day. Pretty early in the morning, on the 15th of July 1992, Colin Stagg decided to take his dog for a walk on Wimbledon Common. Now, this was before Rachel and Alex arrived on the Common that morning, so this was before she had been murdered. So he was walking his dog along the Common. However, Colin actually had a really bad headache that morning, and so he decided to cut his walk short. He would usually walk his dog for quite a long time, I believe, but because of his headache, he decided to just go back home, take some painkillers and rest so that hopefully his headache would pass. And whilst he was resting at his flat, Rachel Nickell, her son Alex and their dog Mollie made their way to Wimbledon Common, where Rachel would soon be stabbed to death. a little while later, after Rachel had died, Colin's headache had passed, and so he decided to get changed and take his dog back to the common for a longer walk. However, by the time he got there, Rachel's body had been discovered, and there were police officers guarding the common, obviously making sure no one went near the crime scene. And so when Colin tried to go back onto the common with his dog, he was stopped by an officer, and Colin asked this officer what had happened. The officer explained that the body of a young woman had been found on the common, and Colin was shocked, and he told the officer that he had been on the common earlier that morning, but that he hadn't seen anything, he hadn't seen anything suspicious, obviously because at that time the murder hadn't happened yet. The officer asked Colin for his name and his address, just like all the people on the common that day had been asked for, and he had no issue handing over this information, and then he just went back home to his flat. And then fast forward to September of 1992. It had been around 2 months since Rachel was killed when the Crime Watch episode featuring the character profile and the photo fit image of the main suspect was released, and the police were receiving quite a few phone calls from members of the public saying that they believed the man they were describing and the image of the suspect looked a lot like 29-year-old Colin Stagg. They also believed that he matched the description of Paul Britton's psychological profile of the killer. He lived alone, he didn't have a partner, he was between the age of 20 to 30. So the day after the Crime Watch episode aired, the police went to Colin Stagg's flat in Wimbledon, and they told him that they were investigating him as a person of interest in the murder of Rachel Nickell. Detectives began just having a look around his flat, and there were a few things that they came across in his home that they thought were concerning. So on some of the walls in his flat, he had, I think it was like a blackboard, and there were a lot of drawings on this blackboard that the detectives felt were related to Satanism. They were satanic drawings. Although in truth, these drawings were actually done by Colin's brother. Colin said that his brother lived in the flat before him, and he was really into like heavy metal music, and he just liked drawing these like symbols and stuff. And when Colin moved into the flat, he just never bothered to take them down, so he just kept them up. But when the detectives saw them, it seems as though they just ran with it. They jumped to the conclusion that he had to be the killer because he had these satanic drawings on his walls. According to some sources, in his flat, the police also found books on the occult, some gloves, and a sheath knife. Now, this knife wasn't the one that was used to stab Rachel, but it indicated to the police that perhaps this man had an interest in knives. Anyway, Colin was arrested and he was taken into the police station for questioning, and he was just in shock. He had never been arrested before for anything, let alone murder, and of course he knew that he hadn't done this. He hadn't done this crime, so I mean, it must have just been absolutely terrifying for him. The police interviewed Colin Stagg over 3 days, and they were just asking him what he was doing on the day of Rachel's murder. Was he on Wimbledon Common? To which he replied yes, because he was. As we know, he had walked his dog that morning on the common. Colin was very open with the police. He told them everything that he could, but of course he kept saying that he had no involvement in Rachel's murder. 2 days into Colin's arrest, he was picked out of an identity parade by that woman Jane, who claimed to witness a man acting really suspiciously on Wimbledon Common on the day of Rachel's murder. She said that the man that she saw on the common that day looked like Colin Stagg. But the thing that confuses me about this is that Jane literally said that one of the reasons why she thought this man on the common was really suspicious was because he wouldn't really let Jane look at his face. Every time she looked at him, he would like turn away and hide his face. So how could she be certain that it was Colin Stagg when she didn't really get a good look at this man? As the detectives continued questioning Colin, they were also looking into previous incidents on Wimbledon Common that happened before Rachel's murder to see if they could link any of them to Colin. And they actually did. Basically, earlier that same summer, before Rachel's death, a woman had reported to the police that there was a man on the common that matched the description of Colin Stagg, and he was naked and he apparently had an erection. Some sources claim that he exposed himself to the woman, and so she reported the incident to the police. The police had reason to believe that this man that was naked on the common that summer was Colin Stagg, and so they just asked him if it was. And Colin said, yeah, that was me. He admitted that he was naked on the common. He said that he was nude sunbathing in a spot that was used often by other nude sunbathers, and he said that it was something that he did every single summer. So the detectives decided to charge him with indecent exposure for that incident, and Colin was advised by his solicitor to just plead guilty to that, although in hindsight that probably wasn't the best decision, because now the police and the media and the public saw this man as a sex offender. They believed he was a pervert who exposed himself to people on Wimbledon Common, the same place where Rachel Nickell was killed and sexually assaulted. Colin was fined £200 for the indecent exposure charge, and then after that he was just let go. The detectives still firmly believed that he was Rachel's murderer, but they had no evidence to be able to charge him, and so he had to be let go. But people were outraged. They believed that a killer had just been let go, and so the press followed Colin pretty much everywhere. They would film him, take pictures of him, and they would sell these pictures to the newspapers. They would print headlines about Colin in which they said that he was a sex pest and a pervert and a murderer. And the police weren't giving up on Colin either. They were determined to find some evidence to say that he was Rachel Nickell's murderer, and so they decided to focus all of their efforts on proving that Colin was a killer. They were no longer really looking into other suspects. They were so focused on Colin Stagg, all the while the real killer, Rachel's actual murderer, was free to strike again. Now, as the police were continuing to investigate Colin Stagg as the murderer, they were actually contacted by a woman named Julie Pines, and she told them that she had some information about Colin. Julie had obviously seen Colin's face on the news channels and newspapers. He had gained so much publicity and media attention, and so when she saw that he was a suspect in a murder, she decided to ring the police and tell them about an incident that she had with this man in the past. About 2 years before Rachel was murdered, Julie had put an advertisement in a Lonely Hearts column of a newspaper. If you don't know what a Lonely Hearts column is, I don't actually know if they're still a thing today, but they used to be like a little section in a newspaper where single people would kind of advertise themselves. That probably isn't the best way to put it, but they would basically put a dating ad in the column that says their name, like their age, what they're looking for, and they also put their number, and they just wait, I guess, to see if another single person contacts them. It's kind of like an older version of Tinder, but instead of using a dating app, they would use newspapers to find love. Anyway, Colin Stagg came across Julie's column in the newspaper and he responded to it. He was also single, so he just thought, why not? Let's see if this goes anywhere. According to Colin, he and Julie exchanged letters for a while, and they also spoke on the phone a couple of times, and he thought that it was going really well. He thought they were getting along really well, and he began thinking that maybe this could go a bit further. They seem to be good friends now, but maybe they could be more than that. And so one day, Colin decided to write and send to Julie a sexual letter. And in this letter, I believe Colin wrote about how he wanted to have sex with a woman in the open air or something along those lines. I don't know how graphic it was, because one source online said that it was quite a mild letter. Another one said that it was quite graphic. So anyway, regardless, Julie wasn't comfortable with this letter, and so she just stopped contacting Colin, but she always held on to the letter. She kept it for 2 years. And then of course, after those 2 years, Colin was the main suspect in a murder inquiry, and so Julie decided to contact the police, and she gave them this sexual letter that was written by Colin. And I think once again, the detectives read this letter and ran with it. They believed that because in this letter Colin expressed his fantasy of having sex with a woman outside, that he must have been Rachel's murderer, because she was killed outside in a public place and she was sexually assaulted. But obviously this letter isn't evidence at all linking him to the crime. It was written 2 years before Rachel's death, but it just gave the detectives more of a reason to believe that he was the guy responsible. All they had so far in this investigation against Colin Stagg was circumstantial evidence, if you can even call it that. If they really believed that he was the killer, then they needed to find solid evidence to be able to charge him, and so they hatched a plan. Detectives came up with an idea. They were going to use an undercover female police officer, and she was going to try and get close to Colin, seduce him, and see if he would confess to the homicide. The undercover officer they used was an attractive blonde woman, and they gave her the fake name Lizzie James. This was the name that she was going to use when she was in contact with Colin Stagg. I actually don't know what her real name was. I don't think it is public information. Now, I think I mentioned this earlier, but this whole plan, this operation to catch out Colin Stagg, was called Operation Ezdell, and a whole bunch of detectives and Paul Britton, the criminal profiler, were working with the undercover officer Lizzie James to come up with a strategy. They wanted to coax him into making a confession, and this plan was later described as being a honey trap. So Lizzie James began by writing letters to Colin Stagg, and in her first letter she told Colin that she was a friend of Julie Pines, the woman from the Lonely Hearts column, and that she had read the sexual letter that Colin had written to her, and she found it, quote, interesting. Lizzie said that she was a lot more open-minded than her friend Julie, like sexually open-minded. She also said in the letter that she would love to get to know Colin a bit more, and so Colin responded to the letter. He was eager to know more about Lizzie, and he was really flattered. He had never really had an attractive woman approach him before, and this excited him. But of course, in reality, he had no idea that this Lizzie James was really working with detectives and Paul Britton to implicate him in the murder of Rachel Nickell. So they were writing letters to each other back and forth constantly, and in the beginning, Stagg was, I think, trying to be quite romantic in his letters. He said that he would love to take Lizzie out on a date, out for a walk, and they could have glasses of wine, and maybe at the end of their date he would give her a kiss and a cuddle. It was all very innocent, I guess, and at the time Colin said that he had never had a sexual relationship with anyone before, and he told Lizzie this in his letters. So in the beginning, when Colin was being quite sweet and innocent in his letters, Lizzie was the complete opposite, obviously because the detectives were writing them, and in her letters she would just talk about sex and how she wanted Colin to, quote, show her what a real man is. She started expressing to Colin that she had dark sexual fantasies and that she wanted a man to make her feel, quote, defenseless and humiliated. And so as Lizzie starts becoming more and more graphic in her letters, so does Colin in return, because he really liked this woman and at the end of the day he wanted to sleep with her. But at the end of every letter Colin wrote, he would apologise and he would say, I'm so sorry if I've overstepped the mark, I'm sorry if I've taken it too far. But Lizzie would insist that she liked it and she would encourage Colin to be even more graphic. She said she didn't want him to hold back. She said, you're not giving me enough, I want you to be more dominant. They were really pushing and pushing him, and so eventually, as time went on, Colin's letters were getting more and more graphic, and Lizzie would tell him that she liked violence during sex, that turned her on, and Colin went along with it. He was playing right into the detective's hands. Colin and Lizzie exchanged over 40 letters, but the police still didn't have the evidence they needed to charge Colin Stagg with murder. And so they decided to step up the operation. And as well as writing letters, Lizzie James was going to start calling Colin, and these conversations would be recorded.
I don't know what to say, you know. I never really met anybody like you, you know. Since you first started writing to me and that, you know, it's like a dream come true for me, you know. Not anything like this has never really happened to me before, you know.
Yeah.
Someone's really shown interest in me, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to, you know, throw this away for anything, you know.
They exchanged a couple of phone calls, but they still weren't really getting any incriminating evidence out of Colin, and so detectives wanted to step up the operation once again, and they decided to have Lizzie James, the undercover female police officer, meet up with Colin Stagg, because maybe he would be more forthcoming if he actually chatted with her face to face. Of course, this was going to be risky because they were sending this undercover female police officer to meet who they believed was a very dangerous man. They believed that Colin was a killer, and so they needed to ensure that Lizzie would be safe the entire time. They made sure that all of these meetings would be in a public place. So the first place Colin and Lizzie met face to face was in Hyde Park in London. And I believe Lizzie was wearing a recording device so that the detectives could listen in on their conversations, and they also had other undercover police officers just around the scene wherever Colin and Lizzie were, just in case Colin did try to attack this woman, they would be able to jump in straight away and protect her. Colin and Lizzie met several times over the next few months, I believe. They would meet up in parks and cafes and they would have picnics together. Like I said, it was always in a public place so that other undercover police officers could secretly watch. And during one of these meetings, Lizzie James told Colin this story about how she had an ex-boyfriend, who was into black magic, and she also told him that one time she had taken part in a human sacrifice of a pregnant woman and her baby. And Colin says that when Lizzie first told him this, he thought that she was literally crazy, but he said that he was still so eager to have sex with her, and so he just kind of ignored it, I think. So he didn't really have much of a reaction when she told him that, and of course to the police that was very concerning, because I mean, any normal person when told that would be in shock and would probably contact the authorities. So it was worrying that he didn't really have a reaction. But like I said, the reason why he didn't really have much of a reaction was because he really liked this woman and he wanted to sleep with her. As the meetings continued, Lizzie James also began bringing up the murder of Rachel Nickell. And I believe the two, Colin and Lizzie, had spoken about the Rachel Nickell murder on the phone before, because obviously Colin was a suspect in the case and he just told her that he had nothing to do with it and that she had nothing to worry about. But the detectives told Lizzie James to just keep bringing up the murder of Rachel Nickell, and she told Colin that level of violence excited her and that she actually wished that Colin had done it. She just kept saying, oh, I wish you had done it because that would really turn me on. And it got to the point where she was practically saying, if you say you did it, if you confess, I will have sex with you. Detectives were desperate at this point to coax a confession out of him, but they never got one. Colin maintained that he was innocent, and he just said to Lizzie, I'm sorry, but I didn't do it. I didn't kill Rachel. According to a few sources, he did make up, I believe, a couple of stories similar to the murder of Rachel Nickell in an attempt to satisfy Lizzie, and in one of his letters he described using a knife on a woman on the common, but he still maintained that he had nothing to do with Rachel's death. He was just making up these stories. And I think soon after this, Colin began losing interest in Lizzie. He wanted sex, but it became clear to him that she wasn't going to sleep with him unless he admitted to a murder that he didn't commit, and so he just kind of stopped contacting her. In total, they had been in contact for around 7 months, I believe, and not once did he admit that he was Rachel Nickell's killer. Although the detectives still wanted to charge this man with the crime, and they felt like they finally had enough evidence to do so. Yes, they didn't have his confession. They didn't have any direct link connecting him to Rachel's death. However, they did now have letters written by Colin and audio recordings in which he is describing his violent sexual fantasies. Fantasies that he was very much pushed into having and talking about by Lizzie James. And they felt that this was enough evidence to show that he could have been capable of the crime and subsequently convict him for it. And so on the 17th of August 1993, over a year after the crime, 30-year-old Colin Stagg was arrested once again for the murder of Rachel Nickell. He was taken to the police station for questioning, and it was then when the detectives revealed to him Operation Ezdell, the operation they had been running for the last 7 months to catch him out. And as they were telling him all of this, as they were questioning him, they brought the undercover female police officer into the room, or as Colin knew her, Lizzie James. They read out the letters that he had written to Lizzie, and that's when everything started to click in Colin's head. That's why this Lizzie James was pushing constantly for him to talk about violent sex and murder and the murder of Rachel Nickell. It was a trap the whole time. Anyway, the detectives were questioning Colin, and he just replied no comment to every single question he was asked.
The fact that you see this gorgeous blonde woman approaching from the distance, is that what happened to Rachel? You looked down from your vantage point and spied her, and you rushed down and you ambushed her, and you pushed the little boy face down, into the mud, and you stabbed Rachel 40 times.
Meanwhile, other officers went to search his home, more specifically his garden. They were digging up his entire garden and using metal detectors to see if they could find the murder weapon, the knife that was used to stab Rachel to death, because that was not found at the scene. The killer had taken that with them. But unsurprisingly, they didn't find the murder weapon because, as we know, Colin Stagg wasn't the murderer. Nevertheless, Stagg was charged with murder, but he was still maintaining his innocence, and so the case had to go to trial. Whilst Colin was awaiting his trial, he was sent to prison, and the police and the prosecution and the defence began working on their cases. And it was whilst they were preparing their case, whilst the prosecution were working to convict Colin Stagg, that Rachel's real killer actually went on to kill again. Colin Stagg remained in custody for over a year before his trial began at the Old Bailey Court in London. Now, the police's main pieces of evidence against Colin Stagg were Paul Britton's profile of the killer that they felt matched Colin pretty well, and also the evidence they had gathered during Operation Ezdell. So the letters that were written by Stagg and the recordings between Colin and Lizzie James, that was really all the evidence they had to present. They had no forensic evidence, no murder weapon, nothing else to present the jury. And soon they didn't even have that, because the trial against Colin Stagg had barely begun when the Judge Ognall, looked at the prosecution's evidence and ruled that all the evidence they had collected during the undercover Operation Ezdell was inadmissible. He said that he was not allowing them to present it during trial because he felt that the way in which they went about getting this evidence was unacceptable and unfair to Colin Stagg. They had made Lizzie James push and push and push Colin into talking about these violent sexual fantasies, and they were relentlessly trying to get him to confess, and he never did. The judge ruled that the police's behaviour in their pursuit of Colin Stagg was, quote, a substantial attempt to incriminate a suspect by positive and deceptive conduct of the grossest kind. And so he threw all of the Operation Ezdell evidence out, and now the police didn't really have a case. They didn't have any evidence now, and therefore Colin Stagg was formally acquitted and he walked free in 1994. This innocent man was finally free. However, the media and the public still believed that he was the killer. They believed that a murderer had gotten away with it, and they still harassed him and followed him everywhere. They printed lies about him in the newspapers. Colin Stagg was still so hated by everyone, even though he did not commit this crime. And I'll talk more about Colin and his life, you know, after the case a little bit later on. But Rachel's family were also heartbroken about the results of the trial. They also believed that Colin was the killer because that's what the detectives had them believe, and they thought that Rachel was never going to get justice for her murder. At this point in 1994, Rachel's partner Andre and their son Alex, who witnessed the attack, were actually living in France. They had moved to France not long after Rachel's murder because they were also harassed by the press. I think I mentioned this earlier, but after Rachel's death, Andre and Alex went to live with Alex's grandparents, and the press found their address and they would literally camp outside the home, desperate to speak to both of them and take pictures of them to sell because this story was so huge. Andre tried to protect Alex as much as he could. He covered his face with something pretty much every time they went out. However, on one occasion, a photographer managed to take a picture of little Alex. This picture was sold and it was printed, I believe, in a newspaper or something, which of course was incredibly dangerous because it was public knowledge that Alex was the only witness to his mother's murder, and so what's to stop the killer coming after him and killing him so there was no witness? It put his life in danger, and so Andre just decided that in order to keep his son safe, they had to leave the country. But also, as well as that, Andre just wanted Alex to have somewhat of a normal life. Obviously, his life was never going to be the same again because he didn't have his mother, but Andre wanted him to grow up with some stability. He didn't want Alex to be followed by the press and reporters throughout his childhood. What kind of life would that have been for a child? And so secretly the two moved to France, and they stayed there for a few years, I believe, until a reporter actually found where they lived in France, and so Andre moved them again to Spain, where Alex lived until he was an adult. Now, once Colin Stagg was acquitted, the police announced that they were going to keep Rachel's case files open, but that they weren't really looking for anyone else. They still firmly believed that Colin Stagg was the killer, and they had spent around, I think it was £3 million in trying to convict him. All that money was wasted on an innocent man. And so for years and years, this case remained unsolved. For years, everyone still believed that Colin Stagg had gotten away with murder. But then in the year 2002, it was the 10-year anniversary of Rachel Nickell's murder, and Scotland Yard had assigned a new team of detectives to review the case. They were going to go over all of the evidence that had been gathered about the case over the last 10 years. So they were going to go over witness statements, thousands and thousands of witness statements that were taken at the time. They were looking at known sex offenders and old suspects in the case, just to see if maybe they had missed something. They also asked Andre Hanscom and his son Alex, who by this point would have been around 13 years old, they asked them to come to England to provide new DNA samples to test against any DNA that was found on Rachel's body. Because if you remember, when Rachel was killed in 1992, forensic scientists did find a minute speck of what they believed could have been DNA on her body, but at the time in the early 1990s, they just couldn't say for certain that it was DNA because of the limitations in forensic technology. However, obviously by 2002, DNA and forensic technology was much more advanced and useful than it was in 1992 when Rachel was killed. And so they re-examined the samples they had taken from Rachel's body, and sure enough, there was DNA. There were actually two sets of DNA on her, so two people's DNA. One of these sets of DNA was just Rachel's, and the other belonged to an unknown male. And it wasn't Andre's and it wasn't Alex's. So it must have been the killer's DNA. And so they tested this DNA sample found on Rachel's body against Colin Stagg to see if they could finally have the evidence they needed to say that he was the killer after all these years. And when the tests came back, they revealed that Colin's DNA was similar to the DNA of the unknown male. However, the technology at the time in 2002 was still not advanced enough to concretely identify someone, and so they couldn't say for definite that it was Colin Stagg, but it still could have been. And so they decided that they just needed to wait it out, wait a couple more years, and hope that forensic technology would progress and improve so that eventually they would be able to find a match. And 2 years later, they did. 2 years later, they tested this unknown DNA sample against Colin Stagg again. And guess what? It was not his DNA. It was not a match to Colin Stagg. After all these years of people thinking Colin was the killer, this was proof that he wasn't. So this DNA sample was now strong enough to be entered into the DNA database, and when they ran it through, it flagged up a match. In 2004, 12 years after Rachel's murder, they finally had a match to the unknown male's DNA, and this match was to a man named Robert Napper, a 38-year-old man who at the time in 2004 was actually being held in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital in Berkshire in England. He was a serial rapist and convicted killer who was now the main suspect in the murder of Rachel Nickell. well. But before I tell you about that and the other evidence they found linking Robert Napper to Rachel's murder, because there was more evidence, let me just tell you about his life leading up to this point, up to the point where his DNA matched the DNA found on Rachel Nickell. So Robert Clive Napper was born on the 25th of February 1966 to his parents Brian and Pauline. Robert was the oldest of 4 children and the family lived in Plumstead in southeast London. Now, throughout Robert's childhood, he was exposed to violence. He grew up in a very violent environment because his father Brian was very abusive towards his wife, Robert's mother, Pauline. Robert would witness his father attacking his mother constantly, and so when Robert was around 7 years old, his father left the home, the marriage ended, and the children were placed in temporary foster care. And it was whilst they were in foster care that they began receiving treatment from child psychiatrists. And I believe it was around this time when Robert was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and then later on in his teenage years it was determined that he had paranoid schizophrenia, a mental illness that affects how a person thinks and behaves as their mind doesn't agree with reality. As a result of this, Robert would make all sorts of claims. He would tell people that he had met the Queen. He said that he was a Nobel Prize winner. At one point he said that the IRA had captured him and tortured him and they cut off his fingers, but that they eventually grew back. He found school really difficult. He didn't really fit in with other people. I don't think he had very many friends in school. He was just a bit of a loner, really. He just kind of kept himself to himself for the most part. And because of this, the other kids just thought that he was really weird and they bullied him a lot. They teased him and they made jokes about him and they threw things at him from across the classroom. It was just a really horrible time for him. And then when Robert was around 12 or 13 years old, he was actually sexually assaulted on a camping trip by a friend of the Napper family. According to sources online, this family friend was arrested and jailed for this assault. However, Robert's family and friends said that after this, he was never the same. As I'm sure you can imagine, it really affected him and changed him. Like I said, he was already a bit of a loner before, but after the assault, he just became so much more of an introvert. He was timid and he also became obsessively clean and tidy. I think he probably suffered with some form of OCD. He started being very violent and aggressive towards his younger siblings, and I think he was a little bit violent towards them before anyway, but now it was just so much worse. He would regularly get into fights with them, he would bully them, and as well as that, on a couple of occasions, he was actually caught watching or spying on his younger sister when she was naked. He would watch her while she got changed and undressed. At age 16, Robert Napper left school and he began a catering course, and he was also going from job to job a lot. And when he was 18 years old, his mother Pauline actually kicked him out of the house. She didn't want him living there anymore. I couldn't find an exact reason for this. Sources online just said that it was because of his behaviour, so I'm guessing it was his violent behaviour, or maybe his mother found out that he was spying on his little sister when she was getting changed, and so that's why she kicked him out. But anyway, he eventually got a job working in a plastics factory and he had a bedsit in Plumstead, and in 1986 he was arrested for carrying a loaded air gun. That was his first criminal offence. That was the first time he ever came into contact with the police. Though they didn't actually take any samples from him, they didn't take his fingerprints or anything like that, he was just cautioned and he received a conditional discharge. Over the next couple of years, in his early 20s, sources say that Robert Napper began peeping on local women. So he would watch them through their windows, and he also began flashing and exposing himself in public. And then in 1989, when he was around 23 years old, he began a series of rapes in London that would eventually earn him the name the Green Chain Rapist. His first attack occurred in August of 1989 in Plumstead in southeast London. A woman that lived in the area near Plumstead Common was at home with her 2 children, and she had left her back door unlocked, and so Robert saw his opportunity to strike. He entered the home through the unlocked door and walked upstairs where the woman was drying her hair, and I believe at the time her children were downstairs playing. And at some point this woman turned around and she saw a man standing behind her, and he had a knife in his hand. Robert began threatening the woman with the knife, and he told her that if she didn't do what he said, he would attack her children. Robert raped this woman and then he just left her house, and as he was walking out the door, he said to her, quote, "You should keep your door locked." So this woman contacted the police and a DNA sample of the attacker was taken. Now, not long after this attack, Robert Napper actually confessed to his mother Pauline about what he had done. He told her that he had raped a woman on Plumstead Common, and she believed him, and she decided to contact the police and report her son. She gave the police her son's name, Robert Napper, and the police said that they would check their records to see if anyone had reported being raped in Plumstead. However, the police didn't really even bother to investigate this further. Apparently they checked their records of the last few days, but they didn't check before that, and they just left it at that. They didn't bother to arrest or question Robert, and they also didn't take a DNA sample from him, which is so frustrating because had they done that, had they actually investigated him, they could have linked him to that rape in Plumstead and he would have been arrested, preventing him from committing his next rapes and murders. His mother literally handed him in, but the police just didn't follow it up at all, and so this rapist was free to do it again. And he did. Over the next few years, Robert raped several women, and most of these took place on the Green Chain Walk, which is like a linked system of open spaces and parks in southeast London. Robert would just hang around the park watching women, looking for his next victim and waiting for an opportunity to strike. Over time, the attacks got more and more violent, and a lot of victims reported that the attacker had been carrying a knife. He was threatening these women with a knife so that they would do what he said, and on one occasion, whilst Robert was assaulting a woman, he actually stabbed her in the breast. Now, I don't know exactly how many women Robert Napper raped. Different sources say different things. Some sources say that it was in the 80s, others say that it was over 100 women. I know when he was finally caught, he was convicted for 2 rapes and 2 attempted rapes, but there were definitely a lot more than that. I think he was only convicted of those 4 because they had enough evidence to say that he did those 4, but it is believed that he did a lot more than that. And as these women were reporting to the police that they had been raped, the police were able to pick up on the attacker's DNA after a couple of the attacks from his semen. By this point, it was public knowledge that a rapist was on the loose. Like I mentioned earlier, he became known as the Green Chain Rapist, and everyone was terrified. No woman in that area of London felt safe. The police created a photo fit of the attacker with help from the victims, and this image was released to the public in the hopes that someone would recognise this man, the Green Chain Rapist, and come forward and identify him. And 2 of Robert Napper's neighbours contacted the police after this photo fit was released and said that they believed he was the man responsible for the rapes. And so the police asked Robert to come into the police station and give his DNA sample so that he could be ruled out of the inquiry. But of course, Robert, knowing that he was the man they were looking for, he just didn't show up. And so they asked him again, and he didn't show up a second time to give his DNA sample. And unbelievably, the police just dropped it. They didn't pursue him, they didn't arrest him, they just left it. Robert Napper had gotten away with it again when he could have easily been apprehended. You would think the fact that he just wasn't turning up to give his DNA sample would have been a red flag for the police, but no. Some sources state that the police didn't think Napper was the attacker anyway, because apparently a lot of the victims said that the green chain rapist was around 5'7" to 5'9" in height, whereas Robert Napper was about 6'2". So they just assumed that he couldn't have been the man they were looking for because he was too tall. They didn't consider that maybe the witnesses had just made a simple mistake and misjudged his height. They just thought, well, he can't be the rapist because he's too tall. And so his attacks continued, eventually stepping up to murder. And his first murder was that of 23-year-old Rachel Nickell on Wimbledon Common in 1992, which he wouldn't be linked to for well over a decade. The police failed to make a connection between the green chain attacks and Rachel Nickell's murder in Wimbledon, despite there actually being several similarities, one being the fact that the victims were mostly attacked in a public space, in a park, and also the fact that they were threatened with a knife. And I believe that the team investigating the green chain rapes actually got in contact with the Operation Ezdell team, the team of detectives that were investigating Rachel's murder. And they said to them, look, we think that these attacks could be linked. We think that maybe the man that killed Rachel could also be the green chain rapist that we are trying to find. But the Operation Ezdell team just didn't think they were connected. They failed to link them. Detectives were so sure at the time that Colin Stagg was Rachel's killer that it clouded their judgment, and they almost refused to look into any other suspects. Once again, they had missed opportunities to catch the real killer, allowing him to strike again. Now, about 3 months after Rachel Nickell's murder, Robert Napper was arrested after attempting to print and make copies of police-headed notepaper in a photocopy shop. He later said that he was doing this because he wanted an official police document to say that he could own a .22 caliber pistol. One documentary that I watched also said that Robert Napper was arrested again around this same time after a woman rang the police to say that a strange man had been hanging around the back of different houses in the area, and he was just watching people through their windows, and this man was identified as being Robert Napper. Anyway, he was arrested and his bedsit where he lived in Plumstead was searched, and during this search the officers found a lot of weapons. They found, I think, a handgun and a couple of knives. And one of these knives was actually very similar to the one the green chain rapist had used to stab that woman in the breast during the attack. It was very similar to the one this victim had seen, and yet still no connection was made. They also found a red metal toolbox in Robert's bedsit. Now, I want you to remember this toolbox for later on in the video. But inside this toolbox, he had hidden a couple of the knives, and they also found an A to Z map. Now, this map covered the area around the green chain walk, and it appeared as though Robert Napper had circled a lot of different locations on this map, and police failed to realise this at the time, but what they came to learn was that these areas he had circled were areas where he had attacked and raped his victims. This map was almost like his trophy and his reminder of the attacks. It was a way for him to relive what he had done. But like I said, they failed to make a connection once again, and Robert Napper was just ordered to serve an 8-week custodial sentence for possession of a firearm. After this, he was just released, despite his psychiatrist telling the authorities that he was, quote, without a doubt an immediate threat to himself and the public. So by this point, it was around the end of 1992, beginning of 1993 time, I believe, and so far, Robert Napper had gotten away with countless rapes on the Green Chain Walk, and he had also gotten away with the murder of Rachel Nickell. And after he was released following his 8-week sentence, he was free to rape and murder again, and that's exactly what he did. Now, I just want to give a quick warning. One of Robert's next victims was a child. He killed a child and her mother, so if you don't want to hear about this part, I'll put a time on the screen that you can skip to. But these victims were 27-year-old Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine, and they lived in Plumstead in southeast London with Samantha's boyfriend Conrad. Conrad described Samantha as just being such a devoted mother. She absolutely loved her daughter Jasmine and would have done anything for her. They lived in a flat near Plumstead Common, and it's believed that Napper had probably been watching them for a while and he selected them as his next victims. And the reason that they believe this is because Samantha's partner Conrad said that one night, not long before her murder, Samantha actually saw a man outside looking at her through her bedroom window, and it's believed that this was probably Robert Napper. He was watching them and waiting for his perfect opportunity to strike. And one day in November of 1993, that perfect opportunity presented itself when Conrad left the flat because he was going to spend the night at his father's. I think he was just staying for one night at his father's. But whilst he was gone, Robert Napper entered the flat and he attacked Samantha Bissett. Napper sexually assaulted and stabbed Samantha to death. She had stab wounds all over her neck and chest. There was blood everywhere. This attack was so brutal and horrific. And then after she was dead, Napper actually mutilated Samantha's body, and it was later discovered in her autopsy that he had actually cut off a large part of her stomach wall, and this was never recovered. So it's believed that he took this with him as some kind of trophy. After he did all of this to Samantha, Robert made his way to 4-year-old Jasmine's room, and there he sexually assaulted her and then he suffocated her to death. I believe it was the next morning when their bodies were discovered by Samantha's partner Conrad. He had popped in to see them on his way to work that morning when he came across the gruesome scene and he called the police. So detectives and forensic teams began examining the scene, and forensics began looking at the fingerprints in the home to see if they could pick up on the killers. However, when they looked at all of these fingerprints, it was determined that they belonged to the people living in that flat. There were no fingerprints of an unknown person, if that makes sense. They were all accounted for, and so initially the detectives thought that the attacker must have been wearing gloves when he committed the murders. So with a lack of forensic evidence in this case, detectives turned to criminal profiler Paul Britton, who, if you remember, at the time was also working with the detectives in Wimbledon on the Rachel Nickell case. And he had also helped another team of officers who were investigating the Green Chain rapist case. And now he was working with the detectives investigating the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, and this investigation became known as the Bissett Inquiry. So Paul Britton was working with 3 different teams of detectives in London to come up with a profile of the attackers. And not once did he consider that these 3 cases were linked and that maybe they were committed by the same man, which they were, Robert Napper. And after the murders of Samantha and Jasmine, the detectives investigating the Bissett inquiry actually got in contact with the Rachel Nickell inquiry team and said to them, look, maybe we should investigate the possibility that our cases are connected. Maybe the person who killed Samantha and Jasmine was the same person who killed Rachel. But the detectives investigating Rachel's case just weren't having any of it. Like I've said countless times throughout this video, they had made up their minds that Colin Stagg was the killer, and they didn't want to hear of any other suspects, it seemed. And so again, another opportunity to catch the real killer was missed. Anyway, the Bissett inquiry detectives continued investigating their case, and they decided to have another look at the fingerprints that were found at the crime scene, so inside Samantha's flat. So if you remember earlier, I said that detectives determined that all of the fingerprints that were found inside the flat were accounted for, and they belonged to the people that lived there. There were no unknown fingerprints found. Well, it actually turns out that they had made a mistake when examining these fingerprints. Okay, so no two people will ever have the same fingerprint. Every single person has their own unique set of fingerprints. However, you can get fingerprints that are very similar. So like I could have a fingerprint that is very similar to one of your fingerprints, but they will never be exactly the same. It turns out that the killer's fingerprints were actually found at the crime scene, but that they were just very similar to the fingerprints of Samantha Bissett. And that's why when they were first looking at the prints, they failed to differentiate them. Did I just say that word right? Differentiate. I think I did. They thought that these prints had just come from the same person, Samantha, but some of them were actually from the murderer, and the murderer's prints were just almost identical to Samantha's. They did have the killer's fingerprints after all, and so they ran this set of prints through their records, and they came back as belonging to Robert Napper. There was also a bloody footprint at the crime scene in Samantha's home, and this was later determined to have come from one of Robert Napper's shoes. On top of this, there were also witnesses that came forward to say that they saw Robert Napper in the area on the day the Bissetts were killed. So there was a lot of evidence linking him to this crime, and as a result, he was arrested at his bedsit in Plumstead, and in May of 1994, he was charged with the murders of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. Detectives also began looking into the possibility that he was the green chain rapist, and sure enough, there was evidence linking him to this too. First, there was the A to Z map found in his bedsit that showed he had circled the places where the attacks had taken place on the green chain walk. Furthermore, his DNA was a match to the DNA samples that were taken of the attacker at the time of the rapes. Like I mentioned earlier, he was believed to have committed between like 80 to over 100 sexual assaults, but in the end they could only convict him of 2 rapes and 2 attempted rapes because they only had like solid evidence for those, I believe. In late 1995, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His team claimed that he couldn't be held responsible for murder because of his mental health issues, and so instead of being sent to a normal prison, he was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, and he would remain there indefinitely. A couple of months later, Robert Napper was actually questioned at Broadmoor about the murder of Rachel Nickell, because if you remember, by this point in 1995, Colin Stagg's trial had just completely collapsed and he was a free man. Anyway, Robert was questioned, and from what I can gather, he pretty much refused to talk, and he just denied having any involvement in Rachel's murder. He said that he never went to the area of Wimbledon, but as it turns out, he had actually been in Wimbledon on the day of Rachel's murder. He was supposed to have some psychiatric treatment there, I believe, in an area of Wimbledon that was close to the Common where Rachel was killed. So now I'm going to jump forward a bit to the year 2004. If you recall, this was the year when the DNA sample found on Rachel Nickell's body was finally strong enough to be entered into the DNA database, and when it was, it flagged up a match to Robert Napper, proving that Colin Stagg was not the killer. But that wasn't the only evidence they found linking Robert to Rachel's attack. Now, earlier on in the video, I told you to remember that when detectives searched Robert's bedsit, they found a red metal toolbox. And this toolbox contained a couple of knives and an A to Z map. Well, when they took another look at this map, they noticed that Robert had circled or made markings near Wimbledon Common where Rachel's murder took place. And as we know from the green chain rapes, he liked to circle all of the places and all of the areas where he had attacked someone before. And on top of that, if you remember near the beginning of this case, just after Rachel's body was found, when investigators were examining the crime scene, they found a shoe print, and this shoe print matched a pair of shoes that Robert Napper owned. I also mentioned earlier that after the attack, detectives noticed that 2-year-old Alex, who had witnessed the whole thing, had traces of red paint in his hair, and at the time they couldn't work out where this paint was from, where it had come from. Turns out it was from Robert Napper's red metal toolbox. It was a match to the paint on his toolbox. And all of that was enough confirmation for the police that they finally had the right guy. Robert Napper was Rachel Nickell's killer. Napper was charged with her murder, although once again, just like with the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, he pleaded guilty but to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility in December of 2008, over 16 years after Rachel's attack. And he was sent back to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, where he will remain for the rest of his life. After years and years and years, Rachel's family finally got justice for her murder. And that is it for this case. But before I end the video, I thought I would just fill you in on the aftermath of this whole thing, because you may be thinking, what happened to some of the people involved with this rollercoaster of a case? So once Napper was convicted for Rachel's death, it became clear to everyone that the Metropolitan Police had made several mistakes and missed several opportunities to apprehend Robert Napper. As I mentioned earlier on, his own mother reported him to the police after his first rape, his first ever attack, but they failed to follow it up. And it's just devastating, because had they done that, he wouldn't have been able to go on and do what he did. Of course, even the police make mistakes sometimes, that is inevitable, but in this case, like I said, there were so many of them and many missed chances to stop this man. The police issued a formal apology to the family of Rachel Nickell and the family of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, and to Colin Stagg. They apologised to him, and they accepted that a lot more could have been done and should have been done to prevent the crimes that Napper committed. Paul Britton, the criminal profiler, was also under a lot of scrutiny, because obviously he failed to connect all three cases, the cases of Rachel Nickell, Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, and the green chain rapes. And that was partly the reason why the police made so many mistakes, because they were guided by him, a professional in understanding the mind of a killer. Now, after Napper was convicted for murdering Rachel, Colin Stagg actually received over £700,000 in compensation for the ordeal that he went through. Obviously, he was pretty much set up by the police. He then spent 14 months in prison whilst he was awaiting his trial, and even after the judge threw out the case, his life was never the same. Because for 16 years, or just under, everyone thought he was the killer. Everyone thought that he was this evil monster that had gotten away with murder. He was hated by the public, and newspapers and other outlets would constantly print stories about him. It must have just been horrendous. Like, imagine being accused of murder, knowing you were innocent, and everyone in the country just hating you anyway and believing you were guilty. So yeah, he received a lot of compensation money and a formal apology from the police, although he actually said in an interview, which I'll link down below if you want to watch it, but he said he was a bit upset because this apology that the police made to him was done on TV, and he felt that the police should have done it to his face. The undercover police officer, Lizzie James, who was employed by the police to coax a confession out of Colin, she actually resigned in 1998, and she, alongside her solicitor, also decided to sue the Met Police because they claimed that she, quote, sustained serious psychiatric injury as a result of what she was made to do during Operation Ezdell. According to sources online, she also received a payout of £125,000 in 2001, and this was actually widely criticised by a lot of people. A lot of people felt that she shouldn't have been given any money. As I said at the start of this video, as part of my research into this case, I decided to read this book, which was written by Rachel Nickell's son, Alex. And in it, he talks about what he remembers about the murder, having been the only witness, and he also talks about his and his father's life after Rachel's death. I've also watched a couple of interviews that Alex is in, which I will also leave linked down below if you want to watch them. He honestly seems like such a kind soul who, you know, despite everything he's been through, has managed to stay positive and live a good and happy life for the most part. But yeah, if you're interested in reading this book written by Alex, I will leave a link down below. I think I got mine off Amazon, so yeah, but I'll leave a link down below. And yeah, that is pretty much it for this case. I have been filming this video for hours and hours. Let me know in the comments if you made it all the way to the end. I have a feeling this video will probably be around an hour and a half long. Also, let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case. Before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a Patreon member, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. Please do give this video a thumbs up. I worked really hard on it, so I would appreciate it so much, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys.